The heavy oak door slammed shut, and the deadbolt clicked with a sound that felt like a gunshot. I stood frozen on the porch, staring at the canvas suitcase he had just shoved into my hands. The cold autumn rain instantly soaked through my clothes, mixing with the hot tears streaming down my face. Through the window, I watched my father throw every single one of our family photographs into the roaring fireplace. He didn't look back. He didn't wave. He just left me there in the dark, stripped of my family name, banished by the one man who was supposed to protect me. For over 2 decades, I carried that burning hatred, believing he was a heartless monster. But today, I opened a forgotten safety deposit box he left behind and my entire reality shattered into pieces. I finally know the terrifying reason why he threw me out that night. To find out the dark secret my father hid to save my life, hit that subscribe button right now and watch the full story unfold. Every time I walk into a courtroom, I put on an armor woven from ironclad logic and unyielding composure. At 35 years old, my name is Mariona Bronze, and I have dedicated my entire adult life to serving as a human rights and child protection attorney in the heart of New York City. In my line of work, you learn to read people to see the hidden fractures behind their smiles and the unspoken pleas for help in their eyes. My colleagues often marvel at my fierce independence and my deep, almost obsessive empathy for children who have been cast aside by the world. They call me unshakable. What they do not know is that my strength was not forged in a mold of ambition. It was hammered out of the shattered pieces of my own childhood. Today, my life carries the outward reflection of complete stability. I share a beautiful, sunlit apartment in Brooklyn with my supportive husband, David, and our beautiful 4-year-old daughter, Lily. Whenever I look at Lily, with her wild curls and innocent laughter, my heart swells with a protective instinct so fierce it leaves me breathless. I have spent every single day of her life ensuring she feels safe, cherished, and anchored. I want her to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that her home is a sanctuary that can never be breached. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the city noise finally fades and the shadows lengthen across our bedroom wall, my mind inevitably drifts back 23 years ago to a time when I, too, believed that my world was perfectly safe. Long before the cold reality of New York redefined who I was, I grew up in a picturesque, tree-lined suburb on the outskirts of Connecticut. Our home was a charming 2-story colonial house with a sprawling backyard and a porch that always smelled of fresh pine and summer rain. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode their bicycles until sunset and neighbors left their front doors unlocked. My father, Thomas Bronze, was a senior accountant at a highly prestigious, multinational financial firm in the city. He was a man of quiet dignity, meticulous in his habits, and deeply respected by everyone who knew him. He provided us with a comfortable, upper-middle-class life where financial worries simply did not exist. Our daily routine was a beautiful symphony of warmth and affection. Every morning, the house would wake up to the rich aroma of coffee and the sound of my father humming old jazz tunes as he prepared breakfast. Despite his demanding schedule, he never missed a single milestone in my life. He was the one who sat with me at the kitchen table every single evening, patiently guiding me through my homework, sparking my early fascination with rules, structure, and eventually, the concept of justice. He used to look at me with eyes full of pride and tell me that one day I would use my voice to change the world. We had a bond that felt completely unbreakable. We were a team navigating life with a mutual trust that I assumed would last forever. But the grandest illusions are often the ones built on the most peaceful foundations, and I had no idea that the sanctuary my father had built for me was about to collapse into a pile of ash. During that final golden year of my childhood, life continued to move forward with a comforting rhythm that felt entirely permanent. The changing of the seasons brought predictable joys, autumn leaves to jump in, cozy winters by the fireplace, and the sweet anticipation of spring. I was 11 years old, navigating the innocent complexities of middle school, secure in the knowledge that no matter what happened outside our front door, my father would always be there to shelter me. Our interactions remained deeply affectionate, almost fiercely so. Thomas Bronze was not just my provider, he was my anchor. I vividly remember a rainy, Tuesday afternoon when I came home crying because a group of older girls had mocked my dream of becoming a lawyer. My father didn't just offer generic words of comfort. He sat me down on the plush living room sofa, handed me his favorite fountain pen, and looked directly into my eyes. He told me that a person's worth is never defined by the opinions of others, but by the integrity of their own actions. We spent the rest of that evening sketching out a mock timeline for my future legal education on a massive sheet of butcher paper. His belief in me was a tangible force, a warm blanket that kept the chill of the world at bay. We dreamed big, laughing about how I would one day argue cases before the highest courts in the land. Yet, beneath the surface of our picture-perfect existence, the first microscopic fractures began to form. It started so subtly that my 11-year-old mind barely registered them as warnings. At first, it was just a shift in the atmosphere of our home, a sudden, uncharacteristic heaviness that seemed to follow my father into a room. His gentle jazz tunes grew less frequent, replaced by long, suffocating silences as he stared out the kitchen window into the dark backyard. Then came the late-night telephone calls. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the muffled, urgent sound of his voice echoing from the downstairs hallway. Whenever I crept to the top of the stairs to listen, he would instantly lower his tone to a harsh whisper, speaking in a frantic, coded language I couldn't understand, before abruptly hanging up. The man who used to have all the time in the world for me suddenly seemed consumed by an invisible, exhausting weight. The most alarming signal, however, was the sudden change regarding his home office. For as long as I could remember, that room had been an extension of our living space. I used to sit on the floor in the corner, reading my storybooks while he worked on his spreadsheets. But as the months crawled toward my 12th birthday, that door became a fortress. One evening, I walked toward the office to ask him a simple question about my history, homework, only to find the heavy oak door firmly shut. When I reached for the brass handle, it didn't budge. My father had locked it from the inside. From that day on, the click of the deadbolt became a regular sound in our house. I tried to tell myself that he was just stressed about a major corporate audit at the firm, but a growing, unspoken anxiety began to knot itself tightly in the pit of my stomach. Something was shifting in the dark, and the father I knew was slowly slipping away behind locked doors. That unspoken anxiety reached its boiling point on the night of my 12th birthday, a date that should have been a celebration but instead became the marker of my ruin. Outside, a violent autumn storm raged, whipping the branches of the old oak trees against my bedroom window and causing the power lines to groan under the force of the wind. Inside, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. The house was pitch black, saved only by the eerie, flickering amber glow of the living room. I stood at the threshold of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My father was standing before the hearth, but he looked like a stranger, a ghostly silhouette cast against the flames. The gentle, meticulous accountant, who carefully ironed his shirts and spoke with a soft cadence, was entirely gone. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes carried a wild, unreadable intensity. He held a thick stack of manila folders in his hands, documents that bore the official seal of his financial firm, along with old family certificates, medical records, and photographs. Without saying a word to me, he began throwing them into the fire, one by one. I watched in sheer horror as the flames greedily consumed the papers, the bright orange light illuminating his hardened face. I took a step forward, my hand reaching out instinctively to stop him from burning a photograph of my late mother. But the moment my foot touched the hardwood floor, a spoon around, "Stay back, Mariona," he roared. His voice did not sound like his own. It was a harsh, gravelly bark that echoed painfully off the high ceilings. I froze in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't cry out, nor did I demand an explanation. My 12-year-old instinct took over, paralyzing my voice, but forcing my senses into hyperdrive. I watched his hands shake as he reached for another ledger, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear the grinding of his teeth. He wasn't just destroying paper, he was systematically erasing our existence, wiping away every trace of the life we had built together. When he turned his gaze back to me, the warmth that had defined my entire upbringing was entirely extinguished. There was only a cold, impenetrable wall of ice. "Go to your room and pack your things," he said, his tone dropping to a deadly, flat whisper that terrified me far more than his shout. "You don't belong here anymore." I didn't argue. I didn't ask him why he was doing this or what I had done wrong. Instead, I took 3 steps backward, my eyes locked on his stern posture, before turning and fleeing up the stairs. My mind was a chaotic whirlpool of confusion and terror, but my actions were purely mechanical. I stood in the center of my bedroom, staring at my bedsheets, clutching my hands into tight fists until my fingernails dug deep into my palms. The crushing weight of worry that had built up over the past few months had finally broken, unleashing a nightmare I could neither understand nor escape. My father had become a monster overnight. And as the storm howled outside, I realized with absolute certainty that the peaceful life I loved was dead. I stood paralyzed in my bedroom for what felt like hours, until the heavy thud of his footsteps ascended the stairs. The door swung open, and Thomas Bronze stood beneath the doorframe, holding a large, battered canvas suitcase. Without making eye contact, he walked over to my closet, pulled my clothes from their hangers with a rough, careless sweep of his arm, and stuffed them inside. "Dad, please, what is happening?" The words finally tore from my throat, raw and trembling. He didn't answer. He zipped the suitcase shut with a sharp, definitive snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He grabbed my wrist knot with the gentle grip that used to guide me across busy streets, but with a firm, unyielding hold and led me down the stairs. The front door was already wide open, allowing the cold rain to spray across the entryway. Parked in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the downpour like 2 angry eyes, was the old sedan belonging to my baby Sarah. My aunt stood beside the car, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock, holding a black umbrella that shook violently in the wind. She looked at my father with a mixture of terror and confusion, but she didn't say a word, as if an unspoken pact had already been sealed between them before I ever woke up. My father pushed me gently but firmly out onto the porch, thrusting the heavy suitcase into my hands. The freezing rain immediately soaked through my sweater, but the chill on my skin was nothing compared to the absolute ice radiating from the man standing before me. "You are a burden, Mariona," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the roaring thunder. He looked down at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure disdain. "Look at you. You are weak. And you are ruining my life. I have spent 12 years wasting my resources on a child who brings nothing but baggage. I am done. I want a clean slate, and you do not fit into it." I stared up at him, the rain mixing with the hot tears streaming down my cheeks. I wanted to look for a flicker of regret in his eyes, a tiny sign that he didn't mean the cruel words pouring from his mouth. But there was nothing. His expression was a blank, unfeeling slate. "Get in the car," he commanded, his jaw rigid, "and do not ever look back. I am stripping you of the Bronze name. I never want to see your face again." Baby Sarah grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the passenger seat. I let her guide me, my body moving like a hollow shell. As she shifted the car into reverse and began to back down the long driveway, I broke his rule. I turned my head and looked through the rear window, watching his silhouette stand perfectly still under the porch light. He didn't wave, he didn't take a step forward. He simply turned around, walked inside and shut the heavy oak door, locking it behind him. In that single, devastating second, the 23-year cycle of hatred began. I left Connecticut that night with a shattered heart, carrying an agonizing vow that I would spend the rest of my life proving to the world, and to myself, that I was not the garbage my father had thrown away. For 23 years, that burning resentment was the fuel that drove me. It carried me through top-tier universities, sustained me through grueling law school nights, and gave me the reputation of an unyielding human rights attorney in New York. I had completely buried my past, built a loving family with David, and changed my legal name to distance myself from the shadow of Thomas Bronze. I believed I had won. I believed I had successfully erased him from my life, just as he had erased me from his. But the past has a cruel way of tearing through the carefully constructed walls of the present. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning at my firm. I was reviewing a child advocacy brief when my desk phone rang. It was an attorney representing a minor probate court in Connecticut. His voice was clinical, completely detached from the emotional bomb he was about to drop into my life. Thomas Bronze had passed away. He had died entirely alone in a modest, rented apartment miles away from the grand colonial home of my childhood. Because he had never remarried and had no other living relatives, I was legally listed as his sole heir. The attorney informed me that before his death, my father had maintained a private, heavily secured safety deposit box at the Old National Bank in downtown Hartford. He had left explicit instructions that the contents could only be released to me and me alone. A wave of intense bitterness washed over me. After 23 years of absolute silence, after abandoning me without a shred of remorse, he was dragging me back into his narrative. My immediate instinct was to refuse, to tell the attorney to throw whatever was in that box into the trash. But as I looked across my office at the certificates of justice lining my walls, a deeply rooted need for closure flared up inside me. I didn't want his money if there even was any, but I wanted to look at the remnants of his life, close the chapter myself, and officially prove that his rejection had failed to destroy me. The next morning, I left the comfort of Brooklyn and drove back toward Connecticut. The highway felt like a timeline moving backward, each mile marker pulling me closer to the ghosts of my 12-year-old self. My jaw was clenched, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. David had offered to come with me, but I had firmly declined. This was a battle I needed to fight on my own feet. When I finally arrived at the grand, imposing brick building of the Old National Bank, the air felt thick and heavy. I walked through the revolving glass doors, my high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, channeling every ounce of my courtroom authority to mask the trembling in my knees. I approached the estate management desk, presented my identification, and stated my purpose. I was here to claim what belonged to Thomas Bronze, determined to face whatever cold, selfish remnants he had left behind, and finally sever the invisible chains that had bound my soul to his cruelty for over 2 decades. The bank officer, a stern gentleman with reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose, reviewed my documents with agonizing slowness. After verifying my identity against the court orders, he nodded solemnly and led me down a flight of cold, concrete stairs into the belly of the building, the vault. The vault room was suffocatingly quiet, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of metallic, numbered boxers. It felt like a catacomb of forgotten secrets. The officer stopped in front of a heavy, tarnished steel box near the bottom row. He inserted the bank's master key, turned it with a heavy click, and then stepped back. Gestures indicating that the rest was up to me. This particular box utilizes a vintage dual-layer security mechanism. Ms. Bronze, the officer explained softly, the physical key has opened the primary mechanism, but the secondary digital keypad requires a specific 6-digit master code set by the deceased. You have 3 attempts before the system permanently freezes, and the contents are surrendered to state probate. Do you know the code? A sudden panic seized my chest. A code? The attorney on the phone hadn't mentioned a digital combination. My mind raced as I stared at the blinking blue light of the digital keypad. Thomas Bronze was a man obsessed with numbers, data, and structure. I closed my eyes, trying to think like the cold accountant who had abandoned me. For my first attempt, I typed in his date of birth. I pressed the numbers slowly, my fingertips trembling against the cold plastic keys. I hit enter. A harsh, high-pitched beep echoed through the vault, and a red light flashed. Invalid code. 2 attempts remaining. My breath hitched. I felt a familiar, hot wave of anger rising from the depths of my stomach. Even from the grave, he was playing games with me. Even in death, he was shutting me out, locking his doors, and forcing me to beg for entry. I swallowed the lump in my throat and tried to look at the situation logically. If not his birth date, then perhaps the date of his retirement, or the date my mother passed away. I meticulously calculated the year of her passing and entered the digits. I pressed enter. Again, the system rejected it with a cruel, rhythmic beep. Invalid code. 1 attempt remaining. I felt completely defeated. The weight of the past 23 years seemed to crash down on my shoulders all at once. I felt like that helpless 12-year-old girl standing on the porch in the freezing rain, abandoned, unchosen, and utterly alone. Why did I even come here? Why did I allow this man to reject me one final time? I turned away from the box, tears of frustration stinging the corners of my eyes. I was ready to walk out, to leave the vault, and never return to Connecticut again. But as my hand touched the cold steel railing of the exit stairs, a memory suddenly flashed in my mind, the sound of the deadbolt clicking on my 12th birthday. The day my life changed forever. It was a date burned into my soul, the exact moment he threw me away. Could he have used that? With a heavy heart and nothing left to lose, I walked back to the keypad. I typed in the 6 digits of my 12th birthday, the day of the exile. I pressed enter. The red light flickered, turned into a solid, glowing green, and the heavy pneumatic lock released with a deep, echoing thud. The final door was open. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly pulled the heavy steel drawer toward me. I braced myself for the sight of stacks of hidden cash, property deeds, or offshore bank account statements, the tangible proof of a greedy man's secret hoard. But as the box slid fully into the dim light of the vault, my breath caught in my throat. There was no money. There were no riches. Instead, laying at the bottom of the container was a thick, yellowed scrapbook, a stack of old newspaper clippings from 23 years ago, and a worn leather-bound ledger. With trembling fingers, I reached for the newspaper clippings first. The faded headlines immediately leaped out at me. Federal investigation exposes massive money laundering ring at Apex Financial. Key informant missing in high-stakes corporate fraud case. My father's former firm. I dropped the clippings and opened the leather ledger. It wasn't an accounting book. It was a deeply personal diary, written entirely in my father's precise, rigid handwriting. I turned the pages, my eyes scanning the entries dated just months before my 12th birthday. As I read his words, the room around me seemed to spin, and the reality I had constructed for over 2 decades began to shatter into microscopic pieces. June 14th, one entry read, I found the secondary ledger today. Apex isn't just manipulating stock. They are moving untraceable capital for an international crime syndicate. I tried to take the files to the federal authorities, but the firm's security director intercepted my email. They know what I have. They threatened my life. I can handle that. But today, a black sedan followed Mariona's school bus. They let me know. They know exactly what time she comes home. If I go to the police, my sweet girl pays the price. Tears blurred my vision as I frantically turned the pages, moving closer to the date of my exile. October 9th, my daughter's 12th birthday. The Federal Protection Program told me they have a leak. They cannot guarantee Mariona's safety if she stays near me. The syndicate wants to see if I will comply. They are watching the house tonight. I have to make a choice. If I keep her here, she is a target. If I send her away gently, they will think she is an asset I am protecting, and they will follow her. The only way to keep her entirely invisible to them is to make the world believe I despise her. I have to cut her off completely. I have to make them believe she means absolutely nothing to me, so they leave her alone. God forgive me. Tonight I have to become the monster she hates. I have to throw my own heart out into the rain. The ledger slipped from my fingers, hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. The image of his cold, unfeeling face on the porch flashed before my eyes. But this time the illusion was gone. He hadn't been screaming at me because I was a burden. He was screaming so the people watching from the shadows would believe the lie. He had destroyed our family photographs so the syndicate would see he had erased me from his life. He had spent 23 years living in a cramped, lonely apartment, acting as a disgraced, ruined accountant, entirely to draw the danger away from me. He had allowed me to hate him, allowed his name to be dragged through the mud, and carried the crushing weight of my resentment to his grave. All so I could grow up safely, go to law school, and build a beautiful life in New York. He didn't abandon me. Savith me. I dropped to my knees on the cold floor of the vault. The leather journal pressed tightly against my chest as a tidal wave of grief and realization broke over me. All those years of burning hatred, the bitter vows, the walls I had built around my heart, they were all based on a monumental sacrifice that I had been too blind to see. My father had willingly walked into a lifetime of exile and loneliness just to guarantee my safety. But as the initial shock subsided, a fierce, protective fire ignited within my soul. The helpless 12-year-old girl who had been pushed into the rain was gone. In her place stood a seasoned, relentless attorney who knew exactly how to wield the sword of the law. I looked back down into the safety deposit box. Beneath the diary lay the true weapon, a flash drive wrapped in protective plastic, accompanied by meticulously organized financial ledgers detailing the exact transactions, account numbers, and names of the syndicate leaders who had threatened our lives 23 years ago. Thomas Bronze had not just hidden, he had spent the rest of his life quietly gathering irrefutable, ironclad evidence from the shadows. He had done his part to protect me. Now, it was time for me to protect his legacy. I packed every single document into my briefcase, locked it securely, and walked out of the bank with a sharp, renewed purpose. I didn't drive back to New York. Instead, I drove straight to the federal building in New Haven. As a prominent human rights lawyer, I had connections within the Department of Justice, and I knew exactly which doors to knock on. I spent the next 4 hours locked in a high-security conference room with a senior federal prosecutor and two lead investigators from the Financial Crimes Division. I laid out the evidence, piece by piece. My presentation was flawless, delivered with the calm, devastating precision of a daughter reclaiming her father's honor. I showed them the international wire transfers, the shell corporations that were still operating under new names, and the clear paper trail that linked the old Apex financial executives to active criminal networks today. "This is not just an old cold case," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority as I looked the federal prosecutor directly in the eye. "This is an ongoing criminal enterprise that cost a brilliant man his family, his reputation, and his life. My father, Thomas Bronze, did your job for 23 years while living in fear. I am here to formally demand a federal indictment, and I will be acting as the special co-counsel for the estate." The room was dead silent. The investigators looked at the sheer volume of undeniable proof before them, their expressions shifting from skepticism to absolute awe. They realized that the quiet accountant had handed them the keys to dismantle one of the most elusive financial syndicates in the state's history. There was no hesitation, no bureaucratic delay. The machinery of justice, which had slept for over 2 decades, was violently awakened by my father's final words. The confrontation had officially begun, and I was going to ensure that the people who forced my father into the dark would finally have to face the blinding light of truth. Armed with the ironclad evidence Thomas Bronze had meticulously preserved, the federal government moved with astonishing speed and absolute discretion. There were no dramatic public shootouts or chaotic chases. Instead, the syndicate was dismantled precisely where they felt safest, within the quiet, wood-paneled boardrooms of their luxury hut. Over the next few weeks, the Department of Justice executed a series of coordinated, systemic legal maneuvers. Asset forfeiture notices were served, international bank accounts were frozen, and federal indictments were handed down to the aging executives of the former Apex financial network who had long thought they were untouchable. One by one, the men who had threatened my childhood and forced my father into a life of tragic isolation were quietly escorted out of their offices in handcuffs, facing decades of inescapable prison time for corporate fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. They were defeated not by violence, but by the undeniable power of a ledger kept by an honest man. As the legal dominoes fell, I took on the most important case of my entire career, the public rehabilitation of my father's memory. I petitioned the state courts to officially clear his name, presenting the sealed federal protection documents to a senior judge. The truth could no longer be contained. The major news networks that had once carried vague, damaging rumors about a disgraced accountant now ran front-page stories detailing the profound bravery of Thomas Bronze. He was publicly recognized as a heroic whistleblower who had sacrificed his own happiness and reputation to protect his family and expose a deep-seated criminal enterprise. For me, the true victory didn't happen in a crowded courtroom or on the evening news. It happened in the quiet transformation of my own life. The heavy, suffocating knot of resentment that had occupied my chest for 23 years completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude and peace. The walls I had built around myself began to crumble. When I returned home to Brooklyn after the final court session, I walked into our apartment and pulled my husband, David, into a long, tearful embrace. For the first time in my life, I cried not out of pain, but out of absolute relief. I held our 4-year-old daughter, Lily, close to my heart, looking into her innocent eyes without the lingering shadow of my own childhood trauma. I was no longer the abandoned girl running from a monster. I was a daughter who knew, with absolute certainty, that she had been loved with a fierceness that defied comprehension. The legacy of fear was officially broken, and a new chapter of healing, built on a foundation of truth and honor, was finally beginning to unfold. A few weeks after the final legal declarations were signed, I found myself driving back to Connecticut one last time. This journey, however, felt entirely different from the first. The heavy grip of anxiety on my steering wheel was gone, replaced by a profound, gentle quietude that filled the car. Beside me in the passenger seat was a bouquet of fresh white lilies and soft blue hydrangeas, my father's favorite flowers. In the back seat, Lily was softly singing a song, her carefree voice a beautiful contrast to the heavy silence that used to define my trips to this state. We arrived at a peaceful, sun-drenched cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley. I held Lily's small, warm hand in mine as we walked across the lush green grass, stopping before a newly carved granite headstone. It read, "Thomas Bronze, a devoted father and a true hero. Your silence was the ultimate shield." Ike knelt down, resting the flowers gently against the cold stone. For 23 years, I had traveled through life believing that love had to be loud, visible, and constantly proven to be real. But looking at that headstone, I finally understood the agonizing architecture of my father's grace. His love was not a warm embrace or a happy birthday song. His love was a heavy oak door locked from the inside, a canvas suitcase packed in a rush, and a lifetime of solitary confinement in a world that called him a villain. He had willingly surrendered my affection, the joy of watching me grow, and his own honorable name, all so that I could have the luxury of standing on this hillside today, safe, whole, and completely free. "Grandpa Thomas loved us very much, sweetie," I whispered to Lily, wiping away a single, warm tear that fell onto the grass. "He built a fortress out of his own life, so that we could live in the light." Lily looked up at me with her wide, trusting eyes, nodded gently, and patted the top of the headstone with her tiny hand. In that quiet moment, the final pieces of my broken childhood fell perfectly back into place. I realized that justice is not just about punishing the wrongdoers in a courtroom. It is about restoring the truth to those who sacrificed everything to uphold it. I am no longer defined by the night I was thrown out. I am defined by the incredible, invisible protective shield that my father wrapped around my soul when I was 12 years old. I stood up, took my daughter's hand, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, carrying his legacy forward with pride, honor, and an unbreakable sense of peace. Thank you so much for reading this journey of family, sacrifice, and the ultimate truth of a parent's love. Mariona's story reminds us that sometimes the things we misunderstand as cruelty are actually the heaviest burdens of love a person can carry for us. If you were in Thomas Bronze's shoes, would you have made the same heart-wrenching choice to protect your child, even if it meant they would hate you for the rest of your life? Please share your thoughts, reflections, and emotional reactions in the comments section below. I read and replied to every single one. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the profound power of family bonds, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of unconditional love, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring, high-stakes fictional dramas. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next stories.